The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name not from invincibility, but from desperate need. In October 1942, when Boeing's four-engine bomber first crossed into German airspace in meaningful numbers, it carried 13.50 caliber machine guns, 4 Wright R1A20 Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, and crews who believed their aircraft's bristling defensive armament made them untouchable. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 60 days of sustained operations over Europe, 1 in every 6 B-17s dispatched failed to return, and among those that limped back to England, 70% of crew casualties came not from the dramatic cannon shells that tore wings apart, but from something far more mundane: tiny fragments of steel traveling at relatively low velocity, shrapnel from exploding flak shells, and shattered pieces of the bomber's own aluminum skin. Before we go deeper into how this discovery changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The Boeing B-17 represented the apex of American pre-war strategic bombing doctrine, a philosophy born in the classrooms of the Air Corps' tactical school at Maxwell Field, Alabama, where theorists convinced themselves that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formation could penetrate enemy airspace without fighter escort, destroy industrial targets with precision, and return home through sheer defensive firepower. The aircraft that emerged from Boeing's Seattle plan in 1935 as the Model 299 prototype seemed to validate this dream. With a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches, a length of 74 feet 4 inches, and a gross weight that would eventually reach 65,000 pounds in combat configuration, the B-17 was designed around a bombing mission profile that demanded altitude, range, and the ability to absorb punishment. Its 4 engines gave it redundancy. Its .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet, created overlapping fields of fire that promised to shred any fighter foolish enough to approach. The early B-17C model that first saw combat with the Royal Air Force in 1941 carried just 5 defensive weapons. But by 1942, when the 8th Air Force began operations from England, the B-17E variant mounted 10 guns in positions that covered every approach angle. Waist gunners stood it open, windows on each side of the fuselage, exposed to -50°F temperatures and 200-mile-per-hour wind that tore at their leather flight suits and numbed exposed skin within seconds. The wind noise made verbal communication impossible. Hand signals and intercom systems provided the only means of coordination during combat. A belly gunner crouched in the Sperry Ball turret, a transparent sphere of plexiglass and steel that rotated on a gimbal beneath the aircraft, giving him an unobstructed view of earth and sky while he sat curled in fetal position with his knees against his chest. Unable to wear a parachute in the confined space that measured barely 4 feet in diameter, entry to the turret required removing the parachute, crawling through the aircraft's belly hatch, inserting oneself feet first into the sphere, then having another crew member hand down the guns and ammunition boxes. Once inside, the gunner was trapped until someone could rotate the turret to align with the entrance hatch after landing. If the hydraulic system failed during combat, the turret had to be manually cranked to the exit position using a hand crank system that took several minutes of exhausting work. Multiple ball turret gunners died trapped in their positions when damaged landing gear forced belly landings. The tail gunner crawled 30 feet back through the fuselage to occupy the most cramped station of all, kneeling behind 2 guns in a compartment so small he could barely turn his head, breathing oxygen through a mask connected by a hose that sometimes froze solid at altitude, forming ice crystals that blocked airflow. His position was statistically the most dangerous on the aircraft. German fighter pilots knew that taking out the tail gunner eliminated rear defense and allowed follow-up attacks from the vulnerable 6 o'clock position. Consequently, tail gunners received concentrated fire during initial attacks, and casualty analysis showed they sustained wounds at higher rates than any other crew position. Later in the war, tail gunners were recorded as the most successful at destroying enemy aircraft because they had the best field of fire and because German fighters often attacked from behind while pulling away from head-on passes, presenting relatively stable targets. But success came at a price measured in blood and trauma. These men flew in aircraft that were fundamentally aluminum tubes stretched over steel frames, with skin thickness ranging from 0.025 to 0.064 inches depending on location, thinner than a dime where weight savings mattered most. The aluminum alloy used was 2024 T3, chosen for its excellent strength-to-weight ratio and fatigue resistance, but it provided zero protection against projectiles. A rifle bullet penetrated it as easily as paper. The fuel tanks, built by U.S. Rubber and other contractors, incorporated self-sealing technology developed in the late 1930s through examination of British designs and independent American research. The self-sealing principle used multiple layers: an outer layer of vulcanized rubber, a middle layer of untreated natural rubber that swelled when exposed to fuel, and an inner layer of fabric reinforcement. When a projectile penetrated the tank, fuel leaking through the hole contacted the untreated rubber, causing it to swell and compress against the entry wound, theoretically closing it before catastrophic leakage occurred. This worked adequately against rifle-caliber rounds entering at perpendicular angles and traveling at velocities below 2,500 feet per second, but failed catastrophically when 20mm cannon shells struck at oblique trajectories, tearing irregular holes that the swelling rubber could not seal, or when incendiary rounds ignited fuel vapor in partially filled tanks, the Tokyo tanks, additional fuel cells installed in the outer wing sections to extend range, used the same self-sealing technology but presented unique vulnerabilities. These tanks were located outboard of the engines, in sections of wing that flexed during flight and landing. The flexing caused stress on the tank seams and attachment points, creating potential leak paths that self-sealing technology could not address. Additionally, the tanks were positioned where hits from fighter attacks or flak bursts were likely, since the wings represented the largest surface area of the aircraft. Engineers had calculated that the increased range provided by Tokyo tanks, approximately 800 additional miles, justified the vulnerability they introduced. But this was cold comfort to crews who watched B-17s explode in midair when tracer rounds found fuel-filled wing sections. The engines, magnificent Wright Cyclone radials with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, could lose 3 or 4 cylinders to battle damage and continue producing power through the remaining cylinders' operation. But their oil systems remained critically vulnerable. Each engine contained approximately 14 gallons of oil circulating through supply lines, oil coolers, and the engine itself. A single puncture in an oil line meant engine seizure within minutes as temperatures climbed past 500 degrees Fahrenheit, turning cylinder heads cherry red before the entire power plant tore itself apart in a cascade of mechanical failure. The oil system was protected by firewall panels and baffles that deflected some fragments, but direct hits to oil lines or coolers inevitably resulted in engine loss. Standard operating procedure when an engine caught fire was to feather the propeller, rotating the blades to align with the slipstream to minimize drag, activate the engine fire suppression system, which discharged carbon dioxide into the engine nacelle and shut off fuel supply. If the fire did not extinguish within 30 seconds, procedures called for continued discharge of fire suppressant while the pilot considered whether continued flight was possible on remaining engines. The crew positions received armor protection in piecemeal fashion as combat experience accumulated. Pilots sat behind 0.25-inch homogeneous steel plate that stopped pistol rounds and shell fragments, traveling below 1,000 feet per second, but not rifle bullets at close range traveling above 2,000 feet per second. The armor plate was mounted on brackets that positioned it approximately 2 inches behind the pilot's seat back, creating a gap that allowed air circulation to prevent heat buildup. The gap also meant that fragments striking at oblique angles could deflect around the plate edges, a vulnerability that would later be addressed through extended side plates. Later B-17 models added 0.31-inch plate behind the co-pilot's seat, recognizing that co-pilots were equally vulnerable and that loss of both pilots inevitably meant loss of the aircraft. The top turret gunner, who also served as flight engineer, enjoyed some protection from the turret's armored ring. A steel collar, approximately 0.5 inches thick, that shielded his lower body when he was standing in operating position, but left his head and shoulders exposed when he traversed the guns to engage targets. Waist gunners received folding armor panels they could position for protection during engagement, but using them meant restricting their field of fire and limiting their ability to track targets across wide angles. The panels, made of 0.25-inch steel plate and frames that allowed them to swing on hinges, weighed approximately 40 pounds each and had to be manually positioned before combat. This created a tactical dilemma. Position the armor early based on predicted threat direction and sacrifice flexibility, or wait until combat started and risk taking hits before protection was in place. Most experienced waist gunners developed techniques for quick armor deployment, using practice drills during training flights to reduce deployment time to under 10 seconds. The bombardier in the nose occupied a greenhouse of plexiglass with virtually no protection, crouching over his Norton bomb sight during the bomb run while flak bursts walked through the formation, and German fighters attacked head-on, closing at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour. The plexiglass panels, approximately 0.75 inches thick, were designed to withstand bird strikes and wind pressure, but offered no ballistic protection. Small caliber rounds penetrated cleanly, creating starred cracks that spread across the panel, but usually didn't cause catastrophic failure. Cannon shells shattered the panels into fragments that became secondary projectiles, lacerating anyone in the nose compartment. The strategic bombing campaign that unfolded over Europe in 1942 and 1943 operated on mathematical principles that proved devastatingly flawed. 8th Air Force planners calculated that tight combat box formations, with 18 or more aircraft stacked in staggered altitudes and positions, could generate sufficient overlapping defensive fire to make fighter attacks suicidal. They assigned each bomb group a specific altitude block, typically separated by 500-foot intervals, and positioned lead aircraft where their defensive guns covered tail and belly approaches for trailing planes. The mathematical model assumed that each defensive gun had a 15% probability of hitting an attacking fighter during a 3-second engagement window, and that formations with 50 or more defensive guns would achieve multiple hits on any attacker, resulting in fighter destruction or damage sufficient to abort the attack. Within each group, squadrons flew in 3 ship elements, with the lead aircraft slightly ahead and lower than its wingman, creating a stepped formation where top turrets from trailing aircraft protected the belly of the plane ahead, and waist guns from the lead aircraft covered the approach angles for following planes. The vertical separation between elements was calculated to prevent friendly fire while maintaining close enough spacing that defensive coverage remained unbroken. When 3 groups assembled into a wing formation at different altitudes, theoretically, they created a cubic volume of airspace filled with 648.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of throwing a 1.7-ounce projectile at 2,900 feet per second velocity, with energy sufficient to penetrate quarter-inch steel plate at 500 yards range. The theory assumed that enemy fighters would be forced to penetrate this cone of fire for at least 3 seconds to reach effective firing range of 800 to 1,000 yards, during which time they would be subjected to concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft. Gunnery doctrine taught that each gunner should fire short bursts of 5 to 7 rounds to conserve ammunition and maintain barrel temperature below critical levels, but also emphasized that concentrated fire from multiple guns was more effective than single-gun tracking. The formation briefing stressed that every gunner needed to fire at any fighter approaching the formation, regardless of whether it was directly threatening his own aircraft, because collective fire created the defensive barrier that protected the entire formation. In practice, German fighter pilots, who were not statisticians but survivors who learned through brutal trial and error, rapidly developed tactics that exploited the B-17's fundamental vulnerabilities. They recognized that the mathematical models assumed fighters would attack singly and maintain steady approach angles that gave gunners predictable tracking solutions. Instead, Luftwaffe units developed the Sturmgruppe tactic, where heavily armed FW-190s, equipped with additional 20mm and 30mm cannons, approached in line astern formation at high closing speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour. Each pilot opened fire at 1,000 yards range, holding the trigger down during a 3-second burst that sent 30 to 40 cannon shells and hundreds of machine gun bullets into the target bomber, then breaking away with a violent pull-up or split-S maneuver that took them out of the defensive fire zone before gunners could establish effective tracking solutions. The high closing speed meant that gunners had to achieve nearly perfect lead calculations within 2 seconds or their fire would miss astern of the rapidly approaching fighter. The violent breakaway maneuver took fighters into vertical flight paths where waist guns and tail guns could not traverse fast enough to maintain tracking. The revelation that fundamentally changed bomber crew protection came from squadron medical records and casualty reports that began accumulating at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England. By late 1942, when medical officers working under primitive field conditions in converted country estates and requisitioned manor houses analyzed the wounds sustained by returning crewmen, they discovered a pattern that contradicted every assumption about air combat lethality. High-velocity 20mm cannon shells from Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109 certainly killed men, tearing through aluminum skin and creating jagged exit wounds that left gunners slumped over their weapons or bombardiers spread across the nose compartment in pieces, too damaged for body bags. The wounds from cannon shells were catastrophic. Thoracic cavities emptied by explosive detonation, limbs severed, skulls opened. No amount of armor could protect against direct cannon hits traveling at 3,500 feet per second and carrying explosive charges designed to penetrate aircraft structure. That these dramatic kills represented only 30% of casualties admitted to 8th Air Force medical facilities. The remaining 70% came from fragmentation. Irregular chunks of steel, ranging from the size of a grain of rice to a playing card, with masses between 0.1 and 5.0 ounces, traveling at velocities between 300 and 1,200 feet per second, depending on distance from detonation point and fragment trajectory relative to shell burst. These fragments originated from German 88mm flak shells bursting at predetermined altitudes, calculated by sophisticated Wurzburg radar-guided fire control predictors that measured bomber formation speed using Doppler shift. Determined altitude through triangulation from multiple radar sets. Computed heading through successive position plotting. then calculated ideal detonation points that maximize probability of fragments intersecting bomber flight paths. Each 88mm shell contained 2.2 pounds of amatol, explosive surrounded by a steel casing approximately 5mm thick. Designed through metallurgical analysis and detonation testing to fracture into approximately 1,500 pieces upon high explosive detonation. The casing was scored in a grid pattern that encouraged fragmentation along preferred fracture planes, creating relatively uniform fragment sizes rather than random breakup down at 25,000 feet altitude, where B-17 formations typically flew to stay above light flak effective range, while maintaining adequate engine power from thin atmosphere. These shells burst in black clouds from picric acid, smokeless powder that filled volumes of approximately 100 feet diameter with supersonic shrapnel. The fragments punched through aluminum skin with ease, their irregular shapes and tumbling flight creating ragged entry holes. They struck oxygen bottles and ruptured them, turning pressurized steel containers into secondary projectiles that ricocheted through the fuselage. They ricocheted off steel structural members with unpredictable trajectories, bouncing through confined spaces and striking crew members from unexpected angles. And most importantly, they penetrated human bodies with sufficient energy to cause deep wounds. But unlike high-velocity projectiles that passed completely through tissue, these fragments lodged in muscle, organs, and bone, causing hemorrhage, shock, and infection. Colonel Malcolm Grow, the 8th Air Force Surgeon General, possessed credentials that uniquely qualified him to recognize the pattern these wounds represented. With a medical degree from Jefferson Medical College, earned in 1920, combat experience from World War I where he had treated casualties in field hospitals behind the Western Front, and subsequent experience in aviation medicine during the interwar years, Grow understood both trauma surgery and the specific demands of aerial warfare. In October 1942, operating from Bushy Park near London and coordinating a network of medical facilities scattered across 8th Air Force bases throughout England, he began maintaining detailed records of every wounded airman who passed through his surgical theaters. This was not standard practice. Normal procedure recorded wounds in general categories for statistical reporting, but Grow insisted on detailed documentation that captured information standard forms did not request. Each wound received meticulous documentation. Entry angle measured in degrees from anatomical landmarks. Depth of penetration determined through probing and surgical exploration. Associated damage to organs and bones documented during treatment, and most critically, the fragment that caused it when it could be recovered during surgery or postmortem examination. Grow collected these fragments in labeled glass jars, cataloging them by mission date, aircraft tail number, crew position, and anatomical location struck. He measured and weighed each fragment, noted its shape and material composition, and attempted to determine its origin, whether it came from flak shells, damaged aircraft structure, or damaged equipment. Within 6 weeks, he possessed hundreds of specimens, and the pattern they revealed was unambiguous and demanded immediate action. The majority of fragments showed evidence of relatively low velocity impact. They penetrated skin and muscle, but lacked the kinetic energy to pass completely through the human torso, stopping in tissue after traveling several inches. The wound tracks showed tumbling characteristics, where the fragment entered at one angle but changed trajectory as it encountered tissue of varying density, creating wound channels that curved rather than proceeding straight through. They tumbled in flight before impact, striking at random angles rather than nose first, which increased the effective cross-section presented to tissue and increased energy transfer. Most significantly for protection considerations, calculations of fragment kinetic energy based on penetration, depth, and wound characteristics indicated that most possessed energies below 200 foot-pounds at impact energy levels that could be stopped by relatively thin steel plate properly designed and positioned. This discovery collided with institutional resistance that nearly prevented the innovation that would save thousands of lives. The Air Corps had examined body armor as early as 1980, during the final year of World War I, when crude vests made of overlapping steel plates were tested with pilots and observers in observation balloons and reconnaissance aircraft. Those tests rejected armor as impractical because the plates available in 1918 were either too heavy for sustained wear during multi-hour flights or too thin to provide reliable protection. A vest that could stop rifle bullets weighed approximately 35 pounds and restricted movement to the point where pilots could not operate controls effectively. Lighter vests weighing 15 to 20 pounds stopped pistol rounds and shell fragments inconsistently. The official conclusion in 1919 was that armor sufficient to provide reliable protection would be too heavy for aviators who needed freedom of movement and could not afford the physiological burden of carrying additional weight while performing demanding tasks at altitude. In 1942, this conclusion remained institutional orthodoxy. The official position, embedded in procurement regulations and training doctrine, stated that armor sufficient to stop bullets would be too heavy for aircraft crewmen to wear during 10-hour missions at altitude where every breath required conscious effort and every movement fought against oxygen deprivation and cold that sapped strength. Rowe disagreed, and his disagreement was based not on theory, but on direct observation of wounds and analysis of the specific threat that actually caused casualties. Working with engineers from the Wilkinson Sword Company, a British firm famous for quality sword manufacture since medieval times that had transitioned to wartime production of armor plate and other military equipment, he designed a vest using overlapping squares of manganese steel, each plate measuring approximately 2.5 inches square and 1 millimeter thick, about the thickness of 2 stacked dimes. The dimensions were chosen through experimental determination of minimum thickness, required to stop typical flak fragments while maintaining flexibility and reasonable weight. Manganese steel, an alloy containing 11 to 14% manganese compared to the 0.3 to 0.6% found in ordinary carbon steel, possessed exceptional impact resistance due to a phenomenon called work hardening. When struck by a projectile, the surface layer of manganese steel underwent instant strain, hardening through dislocation, pile-up, and phase transformation, becoming temporarily harder than the fragment trying to penetrate it. The transformation occurred in microseconds as the shock wave from impact propagated through the crystalline structure, creating a hardened region directly beneath the impact point that resisted penetration. Behind this hardened surface layer, the steel remained relatively ductile, allowing it to absorb energy through plastic deformation rather than shattering. This combination of surface hardness and internal toughness made manganese steel ideal for armor applications where impacts came from irregular fragments rather than uniform projectiles. The plates were arranged in overlapping layers like roof shingles and sewn into quilted fabric pockets, creating a flexible vest that weighed approximately 8 pounds and could be worn over standard flight gear without excessive restriction. The overlapping arrangement meant that fragments striking any point encountered at least 2 layers of steel separated by an air gap of approximately 3 millimeters. This spacing was crucial. When a fragment penetrated the first layer, it lost energy and began tumbling, then encountered the second layer while moving slower and at an unfavorable angle, dramatically reducing its probability of complete penetration. Engineers calculated that the 2-layer system increased protection by approximately 150% compared to a single layer of twice the thickness. Due to the disruption of fragment stability between layers, the testing protocol Grow established was grimly practical and reflected the urgency of the situation. Standard military testing procedures in 1942 would have required extensive laboratory testing. Ballistic gelatin trials to simulate human tissue response. Mechanical testing of plate materials to verify specifications, review by multiple technical committees, and approval through bureaucratic channels that typically required 6 to 12 months. Grow bypassed this system through a procedure that would be recognized today as rapid fielding under combat exigency provisions. In March 1943, he obtained authorization directly from Major General IRA Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, to issue 12 prototype vests to crews in the 303rd Bomb Group, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced units, flying B-17 F-bombers from Molesworth Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England. The 303rd had been in combat since November 1942 and had developed reputation for aggressive tactics and high mission completion rates, making them ideal for realistic equipment testing. These crews would wear the vests on actual combat missions, and after each sortie, Grow's medical staff would interview them about comfort, mobility, heat stress, restriction of movement, and most importantly, hits sustained. The interviews followed standardized questionnaire that asked specific questions about how the vest affected their ability to perform duties. Could you operate your gun normally? Did the vest interfere with reaching controls or ammunition? Did it cause pain or pressure points during extended wear? How was breathing affected? Each crew member's responses were recorded verbatim and compiled for analysis. If the vest was struck, detailed measurements were taken. Fragment impact location on the vest, penetration depth, fragment mass, and composition if recovered, whether the wearer was injured, and if so, the severity of injury compared to what would have been expected without protection. The results arrived within weeks, carried back by aircraft returning from missions deep into German-held territory. A waist gunner named Technical Sergeant Philip Taylor flew a mission to Schweinfurt on March 18, 1943, as part of an ongoing campaign against ball-bearing production facilities that German industry depended on for virtually all rotating machinery from tank transmissions to aircraft engines. He wore one of Grow's prototype vests throughout the mission, which lasted 9 hours and 20 minutes from engine start to shutdown. The mission profile called for assembly over England, crossing the Channel at 20,000 feet, climbing to 25,000 feet over France, penetrating German airspace to Schweinfurt, which lay nearly 500 miles inland, conducting the bomb run through intense flak, then returning by the same route. During the bomb run, German 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft batteries laid down a barrage that controllers later described as the heaviest yet encountered. Flak bursts walked through the formation in orchestrated salvos, with shells detonating every few seconds at the formation's altitude in patterns that indicated radar-guided firing rather than optical aiming. Taylor's B-17 took multiple hits. Fragments penetrated the tail section, causing minor damage to control surfaces. More fragments struck the waist section where Taylor stood at his gun position. He heard impacts against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof, felt something strike his flight suit with tremendous force on his left side, was knocked backward into the fuselage wall, and found himself gasping for breath. His first thought was that he had been hit and was dying, a common reaction among wounded men who often don't immediately feel pain due to shock and adrenaline. He checked himself for blood, found none, realized he could still breathe and move his limbs, and returned to his gun as WWII fighters dove through the formation attacking stragglers. After landing, medical examination revealed a massive bruise across his chest and left ribs, approximately 8 inches in diameter, with severe tissue swelling and tenderness that would persist for 10 days. But his chest wall remained intact, his lungs unpunctured, his heart undamaged, his ribs unbroken. He completed the mission and was back on flight duty 3 days later. The fragment, recovered from the vest, where it had been trapped between layers of manganese steel plate, MEASUR, approximately half an inch in diameter at its widest dimension, 3/8 inch at its narrow dimension, and weighed 0.3 ounces. Metallurgical analysis identified it as steel with chemical composition consistent with German shell casing material. The fragment showed a flattened impact face where it had struck the armor, and its kinetic energy had been absorbed in plastic deformation of both projectile and armor plate. The armor plate directly struck showed a dent approximately 2 millimeters deep, while the second layer plate showed minor deformation, indicating that the first layer had absorbed most impact energy. Without the vest, medical opinion concluded that the fragment would have penetrated Taylor's chest cavity, likely puncturing his left lung, possibly damaging his heart or major blood vessels, causing hemorrhage that in 1943, at 25,000 feet altitude with the nearest medical facility 2 hours away, would have been fatal. A second crewman, Bombardier First Lieutenant Arthur Rosenthal, experienced similar protection during a mission to bomb submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. In March 1943, his aircraft encountered intense flak during the final approach to the target as German defenders, knowing the bombers had to maintain steady course during the bomb run, concentrated their fire on predictable flight paths. The bomb run lasted approximately 3 minutes from initial point to bombs away, during which time the bombardier controlled the aircraft through his Norton bomb sight, making minute corrections to heading and airspeed while the pilot simply followed his instructions. During this period, the aircraft could not take evasive action without disrupting bomb aiming, making it an ideal target for radar-guided flak. A shell burst directly in front of Rosenthal's nose section at a range estimated at less than 50 feet, close enough that the blast wave shook the aircraft and multiple fragments struck the plexiglass greenhouse simultaneously. Several panels shattered, depressurizing the nose compartment and exposing Rosenthal to 200-mile-per-hour wind and -40-degree temperature. Multiple fragments struck him. One fragment hit his flight helmet, denting it but not penetrating through to his skull. The helmet, though not designed as armor, provided sufficient protection against this particular low-energy fragment. Another hit his left arm, penetrating through his leather flight jacket and causing a laceration, approximately 2 inches long, that required sutures but did not damage bone or major blood vessels. A third fragment impacted the front of his vest with enough energy to dent 2 overlapping steel plates inward approximately 3 millimeters, but not penetrate through to his chest. Medical analysis of the recovered fragments showed they were pieces of 88mm shell casing, irregular in shape with rough edges that would have caused devastating internal injuries had they entered his torso. The chest fragment, which was the largest and carried the most kinetic energy, MEASUR, approximately 0.8 inches long and weighed 0.6 ounces. Without the vest, it would have penetrated between his ribs, possibly puncturing his right lung or liver, causing internal hemorrhage. Rosenthal completed the bomb run, released the aircraft's load of 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs, and then helped the navigator plot a return course while first aid was administered to his arm wound. He sustained minor wounds requiring sutures and a bruised chest that caused pain with deep breathing for approximately 1 week. But he was able to continue flying missions, completing his required 25-mission tour and eventually returning to the United States. His aircraft commander later reported that without Rosenthal maintaining consciousness and completing the bomb run, the mission would have been aborted, the bombs jettisoned safely, and the target left undamaged for future missions. The armor vest had not only saved a man's life, but it also contributed directly to mission success by keeping a critical crew member functional during combat. The evidence GROW collected from these test missions and the dozens that followed during spring 1943 proved conclusive. To anyone who examined it objectively, crewmen wearing the vest sustained 74% fewer wounds to protected areas compared to historical casualty rates from comparable missions. The calculation was straightforward. Historical data from missions in late 1942 showed that torso wounds represented approximately 42% of all combat casualties. After armor introduction, torso wounds dropped to approximately 11% of casualties. The difference, 31 percentage points, represented wounds prevented by armor protection. More importantly, the severity of wounds decreased dramatically. Fragments that would have penetrated to vital organs were stopped or reduced to surface impacts that cause bruising, but not life-threatening injuries. Men who would have required evacuation to hospitals, months of recovery, and possible medical discharge instead required minor first aid and returned to duty within days. Experienced crewmen whose combat knowledge and formation flying skills were essential to unit effectiveness were preserved for continued operations rather than lost to the casualty replacement pipeline. The bureaucratic battle to authorize mass production revealed the institutional inertia and competing priorities that characterized military procurement. Even under wartime urgency, despite overwhelming evidence from actual combat, Army Air Force's headquarters in Washington initially refused authorization for full-scale production. The objections, documented in memoranda between 8th Air Force Headquarters and the War Department, centered on weight and resource allocation. Staff officers argued that 8 pounds per crewman multiplied by 10-man crews equaled 80 pounds of payload that could be bombs instead of armor. On a typical mission with 300 aircraft, this represented 24,000 pounds of payload not dedicated to ordnance, equivalent to 48 additional 500-pound bombs that could be dropped on targets. The argument calculated that this bomb tonnage, dropped with typical accuracy rates, would destroy X number of buildings, machines, or enemy soldiers, producing more strategic effect than saving Y number of bomber crewmen would contribute to the overall war effort. GROW countered these calculations with arguments based on operational reality rather than abstract resource allocation. He pointed out that replacement crews represented far greater logistical burden than armor weight. Each replacement crewman required training approximately 1 year from enlistment to combat-ready status for pilots and navigators, 6 months for gunners and radio operators. Each required transport across the Atlantic, consuming shipping capacity that could otherwise carry ammunition, fuel, or other supplies. Each inexperienced replacement crew flew less effectively than veteran crews they replaced, requiring more missions to achieve the same target damage, exposing more aircraft to enemy fire to accomplish the same objectives. Veteran crews who had completed 10 or 15 missions understood formation flying, knew how to identify and react to fighter attacks, operated their equipment with practiced efficiency, and made fewer errors that endangered themselves and surrounding aircraft, protecting these men with armor that allowed them to complete tours and train. Replacements multiplied their value beyond simplistic weight. Calculations. GROW also argued that the psychological impact of armor protection would boost morale throughout the bomber force. Aircrews who believed the leadership valued their survival would maintain better discipline under fire, would be more likely to press attacks despite heavy defenses, would volunteer for particularly dangerous missions when needed. The alternative, sending men into combat with protection available but not issued, would breed resentment, reduce trust in command decisions, and degrade combat effectiveness through passive resistance and reduced effort. These arguments, which today would be recognized as force preservation and morale sustainment reasoning, were novel in 1943 when strategic planning focused primarily on target destruction rather than personnel management. British Bomber Command had already implemented similar armor for Royal Air Force crews after similar casualty analysis. Grow noted, and reports from RAF medical officers indicated significant casualty reduction and improved crew morale. The example of an Allied force implementing protection that American forces lacked created political pressure to match British standards. The decisive argument came from operational necessity demonstrated through escalating losses. In the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding at rates that threatened to destroy it as a combat-effective force before strategic objectives could be achieved. The August 17th mission to Regensburg and Schweinfurt cost 60 B-17s out of 376 dispatched. A 16% loss rate that analysis showed could not be sustained for more than a few months before entire bomb groups would be depleted below minimum operational strength. The Regensburg portion of the mission sent 146 B-17s against the Messerschmitt Bf-109 production facility, while 230 B-17s attacked ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt. German fighters intercepted both formations with overwhelming force, and the lack of long-range fighter escort meant bombers fought alone for hours. FW-190s and Bf-109s made repeated attacks, expending their ammunition, landing at 4 bases to rearm, then attacking again. The defensive fire from bomber formations destroyed or damaged numerous fighters, but the attrition rates favored defenders. The follow-up mission to Schweinfurt on October 14th, forever after known as Black Thursday, resulted in 60 B-17s shot down, and an additional 17 so badly damaged they never flew again. The mission dispatched 291 aircraft. 594 crewmen were killed or captured, and countless more wounded. At this attrition rate, which represented 26% aircraft losses, bomber groups would cease to exist as effective fighting units within 4 to 5 months of sustained operations. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Each bomb group had authorized strength of 72 aircraft. If losses continued at 26%, the group would lose all aircraft in 3.8 missions. Replacement aircraft and crews were arriving, but not at sufficient rates to offset losses. Authorization for armor vest production finally came through in late 1943, with contracts issued to multiple manufacturers, including American companies that could meet urgent demand without requiring transatlantic shipping. The production ramp-up revealed both American industrial capacity and the complexity of seemingly simple protective equipment. Contracts were issued to manufacturers across the United States who had expertise in steel fabrication and textile production. The steel mill companies, including Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel, and smaller specialty manufacturers, received specifications for manganese, steel plate, and began tooling up production lines. The manganese steel plates required specific heat treatment to achieve optimal hardness without becoming brittle, a balance that demanded precise temperature control and timing. The heat treating process involved heating the steel to 1,950 degrees Fahrenheit in furnaces with temperature uniformity better than plus or minus 25 degrees across the heating zone, holding at temperature for specific duration depending on plate thickness, then quenching in water baths at controlled temperatures. Too rapid quenching caused thermal stress that created microcracks. Too slow quenching failed to achieve proper martensitic transformation and left the steel too soft. After quenching, the plates underwent tempering at carefully controlled temperatures, around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, to reduce brittleness while maintaining hardness. Each plate had to meet specifications for thickness within 0.05 millimeters. tolerance tighter than most sheet metal work, required and undergo magnetic particle inspection to detect microfractures that would cause failure under impact. The inspection process used magnetic field application while plates were coated with iron particle suspension. Cracks or flaws disrupted the magnetic field and created visible patterns in the particle coating. Plates showing any defects were rejected, melted down, and reprocessed. The quality control standards were strict because a single defective plate in a vest could create a vulnerability that negated protection. The fabric carriers required precise stitching patterns to create pockets that held plates in overlapping arrangement while maintaining flexibility. Industrial sewing machines had to be set up with heavy-duty needles and thread, capable of penetrating multiple layers of canvas without breaking, while maintaining stitch density that prevented plates from shifting during wear. Early production runs used cotton canvas for vest carriers, but this proved inadequate when oil and hydraulic fluid from battle-damaged systems soaked vests, causing the fabric to rot and lose structural integrity. Canvas exposed to petroleum products degraded through chemical attack on the cellulose fibers, becoming weak and brittle within weeks. Subsequent production switched to treated nylon and ballistic cloth, newly developed synthetic fabrics that resisted chemical degradation, maintained strength when wet or contaminated, and lasted longer under harsh field conditions. The treated nylon used for later vests was essentially the same material being developed for parachute canopies, repurposed for armor carriers after testing showed its superior properties. By February 1944, production reached 2,000 vests per week, enough to equip every heavy bomber crew in the 8th Air Force operating from England and the 5th Tenth Air Force operating from Italy. This production rate required coordination across dozens of facilities: steel mills producing plate material, heat treating facilities processing plates to specification, textile manufacturers fabricating carriers, assembly plants combining components into finished vests, quality control facilities inspecting finished products, and distribution systems shipping vests to Europe. The logistics of distribution presented additional coordination challenges that revealed the complexity of military supply chains. Armor vests had to be shipped from factories in the United States to ports, loaded aboard cargo ships for transatlantic voyage, offloaded at British ports, transported to central supply depots, then distributed to air bases where they had to be fitted to individual crewmen. The vests came in different sizes: small, medium, large, extra large, and proper fit was essential for both protection and comfort. A vest too loose would shift during movement, leaving gaps in coverage where fragments could strike unprotected tissue. A vest too tight restricted breathing and movement, causing fatigue during long missions and potentially preventing crew members from performing duties effectively. Each crew position had specific armor requirements based on analysis of threat patterns and mobility needs. Pilots wore vests and aprons that protected while seated. Waist gunners wore vests only to maintain mobility for operating guns. Ball turret gunners often couldn't wear vests at all due to space constraints in the confined turret. The supply chain had to account for these variations while ensuring availability at dozens of bomber bases simultaneously. The continued story of armor development, combat testing, and eventual widespread adoption represented more than equipment procurement. It represented a fundamental shift in how military organizations valued their personnel and made decisions about force protection. The story contains lessons that echo through modern military operations where similar tensions exist between mission accomplishment and force preservation, between resource optimization and personnel welfare. As armor protection became standard equipment and combat operations continued through 1944 and into 1945, the accumulated evidence of its effectiveness grew overwhelming. The complete documentation of this program its impact on the men who flew B-17s over Europe, and its legacy that extends to present day. Body armor development deserves examination through the experiences of the men whose lives it affected. The operational implementation of armor protection throughout 1944 transformed not just survival rates but the entire character of bomber operations over Europe. As production accelerated and vests reached forward units in increasing numbers, squadron commanders modified pre-mission procedures to incorporate armor fitting into standard crew preparation. Before engine start, crews would assemble in equipment rooms where they drew flight suits, parachutes, oxygen masks, and now armor vests from supply sergeants, who maintained careful inventory of sizes and tracked which crewman received which vest. The vests became personal equipment, with many crews marking their vests with names, squadron markings, or personal insignia. Some crews developed superstitions about their vests, refusing to exchange them even when offered better-fitting alternatives, believing that a vest that had already stopped fragments carried some protective luck. That new vests lacked. The weight distribution of the vest required technique to wear comfortably during extended missions. Experienced crewmen learned to position the shoulder straps to distribute weight across the upper torso rather than letting it hang from the shoulders alone, which caused fatigue and pain during long flights. They adjusted the side straps to achieve snug fit without restricting breathing, tightening them just enough that the vest did not shift during movement, but loose enough that deep breathing remained comfortable at altitude where every breath required effort against oxygen mask resistance. Some crews modified their vests with additional padding on pressure points, using felt or foam scavenged from equipment packaging to cushion areas where steel plates pressed against bones during prolonged sitting or standing. These modifications were technically unauthorized but widely tolerated by commanders who recognized that crew comfort directly affected combat effectiveness. The tactical adjustments that evolved alongside armor protection created new operational possibilities that had been too risky before armor became available. Missions to heavily defended targets that might have been scrubbed in 1943 due to anticipated casualties proceeded in 1944 with acceptable losses because armor reduced the proportion of wounded who became casualties requiring evacuation. The calculation was cold but necessary. A mission that wounded 15 men, of whom armor prevented 10 from requiring medical evacuation, was operationally sustainable, where the same mission causing 25 evacuations would deplete crew strength below acceptable levels. This allowed sustained pressure on critical targets like synthetic oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks that German war production depended on. The combined bomber offensive reached its peak intensity in 1944, partly because armor protection made sustained operations possible at acceptable human cost. The Memphis Belle, perhaps the most famous B-17 of the war, completed its 25th and final mission on May 17, 1943, becoming the first 8th Air Force bomber to finish a full combat tour and return to the United States with its crew intact. The achievement was remarkable precisely because it was so rare at that point in the war. Only about 25% of bomber crews in 1943 completed their required tours. The other 75% were killed, severely wounded, or captured. The Memphis Belle's crew flew without personal armor protection for most of their missions, as Gross vests did not enter wide distribution until after they had returned home. How many other crews might have matched their achievement if armor had been available earlier remains a question that haunted Malcolm Groh for years after the war. In interviews conducted in the 1950s, he estimated that armor protection, had it been available from the start of 8th Air Force operations in 1942, might have reduced total casualties by 20 to 25%, representing approximately 12,000 men who died or were severely wounded before protection became available. The late war period brought further innovations as combat experience drove continuous improvement in armor design. The M1 vest, with its overlapping square plates, proved effective but uncomfortable during long missions. The steel plates, sewn into fabric pockets, shifted during movement, bunching up in some areas and leaving gaps in others. Crew members who spent hours standing at waist gun positions or sitting in cramped quarters found that plates dug into their bodies at pressure points, causing pain and bruising that accumulated over repeated missions. The M2 vest, introduced in mid-1944, used a different design approach based on feedback from hundreds of crew interviews and medical examinations that identified specific problem areas. Instead of flat square plates, the M2 used curved plates shaped to conform to human torso contours, matching the natural curvature of chest and back. These plates were held in position by elastic straps rather than simply sewn into pockets, maintaining consistent coverage regardless of body position or movement. The elastic retention system used rubberized fabric bands, sewn into the vest carrier in a grid pattern, creating individual compartments for each curved plate. The elasticity allowed the vest to flex with body movement while maintaining plate position, preventing the shifting that had plagued M1 vests. The curved plates were more complex to manufacture, requiring press-forming operations that shaped flat steel blanks into three-dimensional contours, matching anatomical templates developed from measurements of thousands of service members. The tooling costs for press forming were higher than simple flat plate production, but the improved comfort and maintained coverage justified the expense. Field tests with M2 vests showed that crew members reported less fatigue, fewer pressure points, and better maintenance of protection during extended missions compared to M1 vests. Production of M2 vests began in June 1944 and ramped up through the summer, eventually replacing most M1 vests in frontline units. The M3 apron, designed specifically for seated crewmen like pilots, co-pilots, and radio operators, covered the lower abdomen and groin, with a curtain of overlapping steel plates that hung from the vest and rested on the lap when seated. The apron design recognized that seated crew members faced different threat patterns than standing gunners. Fragments coming from below or at shallow angles pose greater risk to seated personnel because their posture exposed lower torso, areas that would be shielded by aircraft structure for standing crew. The apron extended protection to these vulnerable areas without adding weight to shoulders or restricting movement when standing. The design used hinged sections that allowed the apron to fold out of the way when crew members needed to move through the aircraft, then deploy back into protective position when they resumed their seats. The hinge mechanism used simple ball and socket joints that allowed smooth movement while maintaining structural integrity under fragment impact. The M4 helmet series replaced earlier armor helmet designs with improved coverage and better integration with communication equipment that bomber crews depended on for coordination. The M4A2 variant, which entered service in mid-1944, featured ear protection formed from molded steel that extended down to cover the temporal bones and mastoid processes, areas where major blood vessels ran close to the skull surface and where fragments could cause fatal hemorrhage. The helmet's liner was redesigned to accommodate the leather flight helmet and headphones worn underneath, eliminating the painful pressure points that earlier M3 helmets created when two layers of protective equipment compressed against the skull. The M3 helmet, though effective at stopping fragments, pressed the leather flight helmet against the head with enough force to cause headaches during extended wear. Crews complained that the pain distracted them from their duties, and some stopped wearing the armor helmet despite orders requiring its use. The M4A2 redesign addressed this. through a suspension system that held the steel shell away from the inner leather helmet, creating an air gap that reduced pressure while maintaining protection. The suspension used fabric straps arranged in a web pattern inside the steel shell, similar to the suspension system in standard M1 infantry helmets, but modified to account for the flight helmet worn underneath. The adjustment system allowed each crew member to customize fit, loosening or tightening straps to achieve comfortable pressure distribution. The cloth covering that replaced the leather covering used on earlier helmets resisted oil and hydraulic fluid that commonly soaked equipment during combat when damaged systems sprayed fluids throughout the aircraft interior. The cloth was treated with a waterproof coating that prevented fluid absorption and could be cleaned by simply wiping with a rag. More than 80,000 M4 series helmets were produced before war's end, equipping not only bomber crews but also transport aircraft crews and forward air controllers who faced ground fire while directing airstrikes from vulnerable positions. The M5 helmet, issued late in the war during 1945, provided additional cheek protection through extended side plates that covered the mandible and lower face. The design responded to casualty analysis, showing that facial wounds, though not usually fatal, caused severe disfigurement and required extensive reconstructive surgery. The psychological impact of facial wounds was disproportionate to their lethality. Men who sustained severe facial injuries often suffered depression and social withdrawal even after physical healing, recognizing that their appearance had been permanently altered. The M5 cheek guards reduced facial wound incidents by approximately 40%, based on limited combat testing before the war ended. However, the cheek guards interfered with oxygen mask fit, and some crew members found them claustrophobic, creating compliance problems. The design was still being refined when Germany surrendered in May 1945, ending the European bomber campaign before M5 helmets could be widely deployed. Anti-flak goggles represented another protective item that saw limited use despite widespread distribution. The Army Air Forces issued thousands of these goggles, which featured thick laminated glass lenses designed to stop small fragments from penetrating to the eyes. The lenses, approximately 6 millimeters thick and made of multiple layers of glass laminated with plastic interlayers, could withstand fragment impacts that would shatter ordinary eyewear. However, the thick lenses reduced visual clarity significantly, creating distortion that made precise aiming difficult for gunners and instrument reading problematic for pilots. The goggles also tended to fog at altitude when warm, moist breath condensed on cold lens surfaces, further reducing visibility. Most bomber crewmen carried the goggles but rarely wore them, preferring clear vision and accepting the risk of eye injury. After-action reports consistently noted that anti-flak goggles remained in equipment bags rather than on faces, leading to eventual discontinuation of the program. The human stories of armor protection saving lives accumulated throughout 1944 and 1945 as combat operations intensified and more crews wore improved armor systems. Technical Sergeant James Mueller, a ball turret gunner with the 390th Bomb Group, survived a direct fragment hit to his armored vest during a mission to Berlin in March 1945. The fragment struck with enough force to crack 2 overlapping steel plates and knocked him unconscious for approximately 30 seconds. He regained consciousness to find his chest aching and his breathing shallow, but he remained functional and continued operating his guns during subsequent fighter attacks. Medical examination after landing revealed that the fragment, which weighed approximately 0.8 ounces and came from a proximity-fused shell that detonated near his aircraft, had penetrated the outer fabric layer, struck the first steel plate, cracked it partially, then struck the second plate, which stopped it completely. The cracked first plate absorbed most impact energy through fracture propagation, while the second plate, slightly offset from the crack location due to the overlapping arrangement, provided backup protection. Without the two-layer system, the fragment would have penetrated Muller's chest cavity and caused fatal injuries to his heart or lungs. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, a radio operator with the 384th Bomb Group, credited his armor vest with saving him during a mission to Merseburg in November 1944. His aircraft was hit by proximity-fused flak that detonated above and behind the formation, showering the aircraft with fragments from above and behind attack angles that had been considered relatively safe in earlier combat analysis, but proved deadly as German gunners developed more sophisticated radar-directed firing techniques. Multiple fragments struck Chen's position. One penetrated the aircraft skin and struck his radio equipment, destroying it and sending secondary fragments from shattered vacuum tubes in all directions. Another fragment hit him in the back, striking his armor vest between the shoulder blades. The fragment penetrated the outer fabric, struck steel plate, and stopped. Chun felt the impact as a blow that knocked him forward against his equipment desk and left him momentarily stunned. But he was able to continue monitoring the radio, or would have, had his equipment not been destroyed. Without that equipment, he had no duties for the remainder of the mission, except to watch for fighter attacks and assist other crew members as needed. The late-war introduction of jet fighters by the Luftwaffe, particularly the Messerschmitt Me 262, presented new tactical challenges that armor partially mitigated. The Me 262 could attack at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, far faster than conventional propeller-driven fighters. At these speeds, defensive gunnery became extremely difficult because lead angles increased dramatically and tracking time decreased to fractions of seconds. However, jet pilots faced the same physics limitations as propeller pilots. They had to slow down to aim and fire effectively. And during those critical seconds when they reduced speed to firing velocity around 350 miles per hour, they became vulnerable to defensive fire. Armor protection became even more critical during jet fighter engagements because the high closing speeds meant that when hits occurred, they occurred in rapid succession during a compressed time window. A bomber struck by Me 262 cannon fire might take 6 or 8 hits within 2 seconds. If any of those hits struck crew members, armor provided the only protection that determined whether the hits were fatal or survivable. The strategic impact of improved bomber crew survival rates influenced the course of the air war in Europe during its final year. When the combined bomber offensive reached its peak intensity in 1944 and early 1945, with the 8th Air Force and Royal Air Force Bomber Command conducting round-the-clock bombing of Germany, the campaign's success depended not just on destroying targets, but on sustaining destruction over months. This sustainability required experienced crews who could navigate to targets, survive defenses, and deliver bombs accurately while dealing with battle damage, mechanical failures, and environmental extremes. Armor protection enabled this sustainability by reducing the rate at which experienced crews were lost to attrition. A bomber group that would have lost its entire trained cadre in 6 months without armor could maintain operational effectiveness for a year or more with armor, allowing institutional knowledge and combat skills to accumulate rather than being constantly reset through casualties and replacements. Formation flying, which required precise station keeping, where aircraft maintained position relative to each other within hundreds of feet while flying at 180 miles per hour, demanded skills that took months to develop. New crews flying there. First missions often struggled with this, drifting out of position and creating gaps that German fighters exploited. Experienced crews maintained rock-solid formations that maximized the firepower and bombing accuracy, keeping their aircraft in position despite turbulence, flak bursts that shook planes violently, and the instinctive urge to maneuver away from danger. Every veteran crew preserved by armor protection represented an investment in combat effectiveness that multiplied across hundreds of missions. Their presence in formations steadied inexperienced crews. Their radio discipline kept formations coordinated. Their target identification skills improved bombing accuracy, and their defensive gunnery discouraged fire attacks. The value of experience cannot be easily quantified, but commanders recognized that veteran crews were worth far more than the bombs that armor weight displaced. The medical innovations that accompanied armor development produced lasting advances in combat casualty care. Malcolm Grove's emphasis on statistical analysis of wound patterns and treatment outcomes pioneered what would later be called combat casualty care research and trauma epidemiology. By documenting every wound, its cause, location, severity, treatment, and outcome, Grove created a database that allowed medical professionals to identify patterns invisible to casual observation and develop better treatment protocols based on evidence rather than tradition. He noted, for example, that fragmentation wounds to the extremities caused disproportionate blood loss because fragments often struck major blood vessels while missing bones, creating hemorrhage without the natural tamponade that occurs when fractured bone compresses damaged vessels. This led to improved first aid procedures emphasizing rapid application of pressure dressings and tourniquets positioned proximal to wounds to control arterial bleeding. Grove also documented the effects of cold injury and hypoxia at altitude, conditions that complicated treatment of battle wounds in ways that were poorly understood in 1942. A crewman wounded at 25,000 feet altitude experienced reduced blood oxygen saturation due to the thin atmosphere, even with supplemental oxygen, which impaired cellular metabolism and delayed clotting cascade activation. His core body temperature, after hours at altitude, even with heated flight suits, was often several degrees below normal, causing peripheral vasoconstriction that reduced circulation to extremities and delayed wound healing. Frostbite often affected wound margins in exposed areas, causing tissue necrosis that increased infection risk and complicated surgical debridement. These observations led to modifications in aircraft design, including improved heating systems that maintained cabin temperatures above freezing and better oxygen regulators that increased oxygen flow during emergencies, as well as changes in first aid kits carried on missions. The aeronautical first aid kit that became standard equipment in B-17s by 1944 included specialized items selected based on gross casualty analysis and recommendations from medical officers throughout the 8th Air Force. The kit contained larger pressure bandages than standard infantry first aid kits, sized to cover the extensive wounds that fragments could create. Sulfanilamide powder for wound infection prevention, applied directly to open wounds before bandaging, reduced infection rates significantly in an era before antibiotics were widely available. Morphine syrettes for pain control allowed wounded men to remain conscious and functional rather than going into shock from pain. The syrettes were designed for self-administration, with clear instructions printed on the tube so that even a confused or injured man could use them. Tourniquets made from wide webbing rather than narrow cord or wire, which could cause tissue damage and nerve injury when tightened, provided effective hemorrhage control without creating secondary injuries. The psychological impact of armor on bomber crews operated at levels both conscious and unconscious. Men who wore armor and survived hits that would otherwise have killed or wounded them developed a complex relationship with their protective equipment that mixed practical appreciation with superstitious attachment. Some crews treated their vests with reverent care, storing them carefully after missions, cleaning them when they became soiled, and refusing to let anyone else wear them, even temporarily. Others maintained skeptical attitudes, pointing out that armor only protected certain areas while leaving head, arms, and legs vulnerable, and that a direct hit from a 20 mm cannon shell would kill regardless of armor. They noted, correctly, that armor plates weighed 8 pounds that could have been bullets or bombs, and questioned whether that trade-off truly maximized combat effectiveness. The human stories of armor protection saving lives accumulated throughout 1944 and 1945 as combat operations intensified and more crews wore improved armor systems. Technical Sergeant James Mueller, a ball turret gunner with the 390th Bomb Group, survived a direct fragment hit to his armored vest during a mission to Berlin in March 1945. The fragment struck with enough force to crack 2 overlapping steel plates and knocked him unconscious for approximately 30 seconds. He regained consciousness to find his chest aching and his breathing shallow, but he remained functional and continued operating his guns during subsequent fighter attacks. Medical examination after landing revealed that the fragment, which weighed approximately 0.8 ounces and came from a proximity-fused shell that detonated near his aircraft, had penetrated the outer fabric layer, struck the first steel plate, cracked it partially, then struck the second plate, which stopped it completely. The cracked first plate absorbed most impact energy through fracture propagation, while the second plate, slightly offset from the crack location due to the overlapping arrangement, provided backup protection. Without the 2-layer system, the fragment would have penetrated Mueller's chest cavity and caused fatal injuries to his heart or lungs. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, a radio operator with the 384th Bomb Group, credited his armor vest with saving him during a mission to Merseburg in November 1944. His aircraft was hit by proximity-fused flak that detonated above and behind the formation, showering the aircraft with fragments from above and behind attack angles that had been considered relatively safe in earlier combat analysis, but proved deadly as German gunners developed more sophisticated radar-directed firing techniques. Multiple fragments struck Chen's position. One penetrated the aircraft skin and struck his radio equipment, destroying it and sending secondary fragments from shattered vacuum tubes in all directions. Another fragment hit him in the back, striking his armor vest between the shoulder blades. The fragment penetrated the outer fabric, struck steel plate, and stopped. Chun felt the impact as a blow that knocked him forward against his equipment desk and left him momentarily stunned. But he was able to continue monitoring the radio, or would have, had his equipment not been destroyed. Without that equipment, he had no duties for the remainder of the mission, except to watch for fighter attacks and assist other crew members as needed. The late war introduction of jet fighters by the Luftwaffe, particularly the Messerschmitt Me 262, presented new tactical challenges that armor partially mitigated. The Me 262 could attack at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, far faster than conventional propeller-driven fighters. At these speeds, defensive gunnery became extremely difficult because lead angles increased dramatically and tracking time decreased to fractions of seconds. However, jet pilots faced the same physics limitations as propeller pilots. They had to slow down to aim and fire effectively, and during those critical seconds when they reduced speed to firing velocity around 350 miles per hour, they became vulnerable to defensive fire. Armor protection became even more critical during jet fighter engagements because the high closing speeds meant that when hits occurred, they occurred in rapid succession during a compressed time window. A bomber struck by Me 262 cannon fire might take 6 or 8 hits within 2 seconds. If any of those hits struck crew members, armor provided the only protection that determined whether the hits were fatal or survivable. The strategic impact of improved bomber crew survival rates influenced the course of the air war in Europe during its final year. When the combined bomber offensive reached its peak intensity in 1944 and early 1945, with the 8th Air Force and Royal Air Force Bomber Command conducting round-the-clock bombing of Germany, The campaign's success depended not just on destroying targets, but on sustaining destruction over months. This sustainability required experienced crews who could navigate to targets, survive defenses, and deliver bombs accurately while dealing with battle damage, mechanical failures, and environmental extremes. Armor protection enabled this sustainability by reducing the rate at which experienced crews were lost to attrition. A bomber group that would have lost its entire trained cadre in 6 months without armor could maintain operational effectiveness for a year or more with armor, allowing institutional knowledge and combat skills to accumulate rather than being constantly reset through casualties and replacements. Formation flying, which required precise station keeping, where aircraft maintained position relative to each other within hundreds of feet while flying at 180 miles per hour, demanded skills that took months to develop. New crews flying there. First missions often struggled with this, drifting out of position and creating gaps that German fighters exploited. Experienced crews maintained rock-solid formations that maximized the firepower and bombing accuracy, keeping their aircraft in position despite turbulence, flak bursts that shook planes violently, and the instinctive urge to maneuver away from danger. Every veteran crew preserved by armor protection represented an investment in combat effectiveness that multiplied across hundreds of missions. Their presence in formations steadied inexperienced crews. Their radio discipline kept formations coordinated. Their target identification skills improved bombing accuracy, and their defensive gunnery discouraged fire attacks. The value of experience cannot be easily quantified, but commanders recognized that veteran crews were worth far more than the bombs that armor weight displaced. The medical innovations that accompanied armor development produced lasting advances in combat. Casualty care. Malcolm Grove's emphasis on statistical analysis of wound patterns and treatment outcomes pioneered what would later be called combat casualty care research and trauma epidemiology. By documenting every wound, its cause, location, severity, treatment, and outcome, Grove created a database that allowed medical professionals to identify patterns invisible to casual observation and develop better treatment protocols based on evidence rather than tradition. He noted, for example, that fragmentation wounds to the extremities caused disproportionate blood loss because fragments often struck major blood vessels while missing bones, creating hemorrhage without the natural tamponade that occurs when fractured bone compresses damaged vessels. This led to improved first aid procedures emphasizing rapid application of pressure dressings and tourniquets positioned proximal to wounds to control arterial bleeding. Grove also documented the effects of cold injury and hypoxia at altitude, conditions that complicated treatment of battle wounds in ways that were poorly understood in 1942. A crewman wounded at 25,000 feet altitude experienced reduced blood oxygen saturation due to the thin atmosphere, even with supplemental oxygen, which impaired cellular metabolism and delayed clotting cascade activation. His core body temperature, after hours at altitude, even with heated flight suits, was often several degrees below normal, causing peripheral vasoconstriction that reduced circulation to extremities and delayed wound healing. Frostbite often affected wound margins in exposed areas, causing tissue necrosis that increased infection risk and complicated surgical debridement. These observations led to modifications in aircraft design, including improved heating systems that maintained cabin temperatures above freezing and better oxygen regulators that increased oxygen flow during emergencies, as well as changes in first aid kits carried on missions. The aeronautical first aid kit that became standard equipment in B-17s by 1944 included specialized items selected based on gross casualty analysis and recommendations from medical officers throughout the 8th Air Force. The kit contained larger pressure bandages than standard infantry first aid kits, sized to cover the extensive wounds that fragments could create. sulfanilamide powder for wound infection prevention, applied directly to open wounds before bandaging, reduced infection rates significantly in an era before antibiotics were widely available. Morphine syrettes for pain control allowed wounded men to remain conscious and functional rather than going into shock from pain. The syrettes were designed for self-administration, with clear instructions printed on the tube so that even a confused or injured man could use them. Tourniquets made from wide webbing rather than narrow cord or wire, which could cause tissue damage and nerve injury when tightened, provided effective hemorrhage control without creating secondary injuries. The psychological impact of armor on bomber crews operated at levels both conscious and unconscious. Men who wore armor and survived hits that would otherwise have killed or wounded them developed a complex relationship with their protective equipment that mixed practical appreciation with superstitious attachment. Some crews treated their vests with reverent care, storing them carefully after missions, cleaning them when they became soiled, and refusing to let anyone else wear them, even temporarily. Others maintained skeptical attitudes, pointing out that armor only protected certain areas while leaving head, arms, and legs vulnerable, and that a direct hit from a 20mm cannon shell would kill regardless of armor. They noted, correctly, that armor plates weighed 8 pounds that could have been bullets or bombs, and questioned whether that trade-off truly maximized combat effectiveness.